This video is part of a 12-entry retrospective on the Kingdom Hearts series. While you can still get a sense of my feelings for this game by simply watching the current video, I may make references back to previous entries, so I do encourage you to watch them in order. It's important to note that since this is a retrospective, there will be spoilers, so proceed at your own risk. At its best, Kingdom Hearts 2 has the most compelling and polished combat in the entire series. Okay, I said the thing. Now all the Kingdom Hearts 2 worshippers may want to skip the rest of this video because it's unpopular opinion time from this point forward. But I just want to point out, I acknowledge that Kingdom Hearts 2 is not only a good game, but a great one. Unfortunately for me and a lot of fans like me, that greatness came at a steep cost, as it fails to deliver on a lot of the elements that defined the first title. It never ceases to amaze me how often level design is overlooked in critiques of almost every genre, but RPGs especially. In many cases, it's the make or break factor for the entire game. This is bad news for Kingdom Hearts 2, because the game's level design is abysmal when compared to every other game in the series, barring Chain of Memories, whose limitations and story structure called for a different type of level design entirely. There were only two worlds that I thought were actually well crafted, the first being Beast's Castle, because it was laid out at least somewhat like a plausible location, and the second was Twilight Town, which ultimately ended up feeling like more of a disappointment than anything, because despite its enormous size and multiple well-designed sections, it went underutilized, stuck as a hub for one of the most drawn-out tutorials in the medium, and a bunch of pointless minigames that have no worthwhile rewards. Exploration and discovery made up the very core of the first Kingdom Hearts, and the completely flat and uninteresting level design of Kingdom Hearts 2 removes this element of the experience completely. This lack of exploration also leads to a lack of platforming challenges, which many players could see as a good thing given its admitted clunkiness from the first game, but Kingdom Hearts 2 fixes that with its much smoother controls and vastly increased movement options. Unfortunately, the devs couldn't actually design any of the worlds around these movement options because they were deemed to be optional in the original version of Kingdom Hearts 2, only obtainable if you took the time to grind up all of your drive forms. I mean this with no hyperbole when I say that this could very well be the worst creative decision that the Kingdom Hearts series has ever made in terms of gameplay. Not the drive forms themselves, they're quite entertaining when used in combat, but the idea of locking movement options behind leveling them was idiotic in a game that stresses learning most important abilities through natural progression and the defeat of bosses. Apparently, Square also felt the level design was lacking, since in the final mix version of the game they attempted to remedy the situation by throwing these puzzle pieces all over the place for the player to collect. Honestly, I felt this was a bit patronizing. It does more to show how poor the level design is rather than making it better. There are so few creative places to hide these things that they just stand out in the open, taunting you until you've leveled up your drive forms enough to come back and get them. It's not a matter of player skill or rewarding player curiosity. You know exactly what you're going to get, and you'll know exactly how you have to get it if you played the first game, with either high jump or glide. I guess this does technically incentivize leveling up these drive forms since there's something in the game that actually requires them now. That's more than can be said about the original version of Kingdom Hearts 2. In actuality, this comes off as doubly painful to me because in Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix, they added the Cavern of Remembrance, a short but cleverly crafted dungeon that's filled with satisfying platforming and a few puzzles. In fact, it's the only part of the game that even has puzzles, except for the literal jigsaw puzzles you get by collecting the previously mentioned pieces, but even those can't be completed unless you visited the Cave of Remembrance. This is easily one of the best levels in the entire series, and it makes me yearn for what could have been if the devs had actually designed the levels around Sora's expanded moveset. In the first game, Wonderland was a whimsical yet confusing maze that held a number of secrets. Atlantica had you exploring undersea caves with a full range of motion. Halloween Town had you scaling a giant version of Oogie Boogie. And must I repeat again the brilliance that is Hollow Bastion? But in Kingdom Hearts 2, there's very little to differentiate most worlds from one another beyond their presentation, with the exception of 100 Acre Wood, which I found a highly enjoyable break from the norm, and Atlantica, which, why beat a dead horse? No one likes Atlantica in Kingdom Hearts 2. It's for this reason that I actually like the Pride Lands, despite many fans of the game thinking it's one of the weaker levels. The world actually had a gimmick that made it feel like its own world, and the fact that it puts limitations on my character's movesets made the non-boss battles remotely interesting and challenging for once. Even if you aren't a fan of the first game's exploration or platforming, the fact that the game had those features helped the pacing if nothing else. The way Kingdom Hearts 2 is structured cuts out quiet time almost entirely. You are never given a break from the onslaught of easily defeated enemies, which means that even when the combat is at its best during the main story, it still becomes monotonous. As Kingdom Hearts 2 is now, the flow of the game looks like this. Walk into a wide, flat, featureless area, then mash X until the enemy dies. Then you walk into the next wide, flat, featureless area, and mash X until the enemy dies. Then you walk into an even wider, flatter area for a boss fight, where you mash X until the enemy dies with a sprinkling of heals and reaction commands if you're lucky. It is incredibly dull. Where once there was exploration, there are now only short-lived gimmicks, most of which still revolve around combat but do nothing to change the way the player handles the situation, making said gimmicks utterly pointless. The morale meter in Land of Dragons, the weight limit on the Solar Sailor, the falling rocks and timer during the Pete battle in the Underworld, all these gimmicks really boil down to, in terms of player priority, is defeat these enemies as quickly as possible. The only exception to this came in Port Royal. The pirates being weak to magic and immune to damage when in shadow was a fun and unique challenge, as was the Grim Reaper boss fight that had you collecting all the coins to properly damage him. I would have loved to have seen more stuff like this to spice up the general monotony. In fairness, there are also a few set pieces that do break the mold, such as the Tron bike section and the gift wrapping gun in Christmas Town, and I did enjoy these despite their shallowness for giving me something unique to do that actually fit the theme of the worlds they were presented in. I wish there had been more of this as well. I keep harping on the level design and lack of exploration because it truly is Kingdom Hearts 2's biggest stumbling block, but as a critic, I try to be as fair as possible. And with that in mind, I do have to point out that there is a lot of preference involved here. I do understand why Kingdom Hearts 2's levels are designed this way. The combat is full of large, sweeping attacks that hit multiple enemies at once. It needed space to make this combat flow, but understanding the reasoning doesn't make it any less boring. I'd be lying if I said that the boring level design flat out ruined the game for me. It is a huge disappointment and an immense amount of missed opportunity when compared to the first title and the groundwork it laid, but the levels in Kingdom Hearts 2 are perfectly functional when it comes to the game's combat, which is the game's primary focus. But that's all the credit I can give. They're functional. They are the absolute bare minimum, nothing but colorful arenas of varying shapes and sizes. This means that when it comes to gameplay, Kingdom Hearts 2, for better or worse, only has its combat to fall back on, and if it somehow hasn't already been made obvious, combat is not the only or even the main reason I play the Kingdom Hearts series. It doesn't help that Kingdom Hearts 2 has a reputation for being a button masher, with mash X and triangle to win being a frequently spouted blanket criticism, especially around the time of its original PlayStation 2 release. And I have to admit that that's a pretty accurate summary of my gameplay experience from the majority of the game's runtime. I guess it's not entirely true. I'd often cast Cure and occasionally sprinkle in a Thunder or Magnet spell, but that is what almost all of the non-boss battles boil down to. This isn't really a fault of the combat system itself. There is a lot of depth, strategy, and skill that can be drawn out of the system. Many players have, but the game's encounters were, by and large, not designed to steer players into exploring that depth. A lot of the boss fights also fall into this trap, being easily defeated by Sora's basic yet overpowered combos until a triangle prompt appears, allowing you to perform an action that'll take a large chunk off their health bar if it doesn't finish them off outright. The spectacle is admittedly great, but there's very little skill involved in the combat until the final sections of the game. This creates a problem for more casual fans of the series, where the bosses suddenly expect you to have a much greater grasp on the game's combat than ever expected of them previously. I know a lot of players who got roadblocked by the Zigbar boss battle because it's the first fight in the entire game that really expected players to nail down a pattern to succeed. Between the sniping section and the all-out laser attack, you can't just brute force or reaction command your way to victory, as you can most of the game's content. Now, there's a very predictable rebuttal to all of this that hardcore fans of the game are likely already screaming at the screen, that none of this is true if you played the game on the critical mode difficulty. There's a lot to dissect here for me. First things first, before Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix came out, I'd never heard this used as a defense of a game in my life, and I can't believe the amount of traction it's gained. But I do actually think there's something important to discuss here. It's actually made me rethink the way I critique things. More often than not, before making a critique, I play a game more than once, and because of Kingdom Hearts 2, I've made it a habit to try out multiple difficulties to find the optimal way to play them. I've found that sometimes it's actually a bit counterintuitive. Despite generally enjoying a decent challenge, I found that higher difficulties aren't always better depending on the title. For example, Uncharted on higher difficulties isn't more fun for me. All it does is make the enemies absorb more damage, which draws out combat encounters and ruins the action movie power fantasy that those games are ultimately about. Contrary to this, The Last of Us, a game designed with the same basic controls and made by the same company, actually is a lot better on higher difficulties because it accentuates the harsh environment. The desperate struggles of your characters raises tension during the stealth sections and makes you worry even more about conserving your resources. Both of these games' core mechanics shine in separate difficulty modes, but neither of these games have to be lifted up with the argument that they're only good on blank difficulty. What about something like Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition, where all difficulties are well thought out and highly customizable? Story mode is great for those who just want to experience a massive RPG for its exploration and story choices, and its most difficult mode is a paradise for those who love to min-max their parties. This game actually serves all audiences by having a sliding scale of difficulty, all of which work to highlight good parts of the game no matter what. If you say that Kingdom Hearts 2 should be played on critical mode as a defense of the game's overall quality, you are admitting that the game is not well designed for the majority of players, because most people aren't going to play the game on critical mode. Whether that's because they're not highly invested in the series, they don't care much for challenge, they're following the dev's own difficulty recommendations, or because the version of the game they're playing doesn't even have the option. It's also important to remember that humans are hardwired to take the path of least resistance, and while Kingdom Hearts 2's combat has a lot of options, most players are going to ignore them if they never have a need to use them. Fans of Kingdom Hearts 2 like to point out that the options are always there. Even when playing on easier difficulties, players still have access to almost all of the same tools and can take advantage of a variety of combat options if they choose to explore them. This is absolutely true, but it's also a fault of the game designers that there is no incentive to learn these things through natural gameplay, except, of course, on critical mode. This raises the question: even if I do admit that Kingdom Hearts 2, or any game for that matter, is significantly better on only one specific difficulty setting, is that the version of the game I should critique? Should I critique the game at its best, the game at its worst, or the game at the level the majority of players are going to experience, which would generally be the standard difficulty? I don't yet have a definitive answer to this question, but for what it's worth, I did play Kingdom Hearts 2 on critical mode. In fact, I played all the Kingdom Hearts games on their hardest available difficulty for these videos, and I discovered that in terms of Kingdom Hearts 2 specifically, critical mode causes almost as many issues as it fixes. Critical mode is an incredibly interesting concept, and I'm glad it exists. It offers several key changes to Sora. It increases both the damage he takes and the damage he deals out, making the combat deadlier for both sides and avoiding the usual problem of making all the enemies HP sponges. Though Sora's limited health pool still gives him the overall disadvantage. The game attempts to even the playing field by giving Sora access to a lot more abilities from the start, and far more points to equip said abilities. It's really interesting to have a difficulty mode that fundamentally changes the way the game is meant to be played, but despite what die-hard fans would have you believe, it's not a cure-all. I do admit that I feel it's the better way to play the game because it requires players to dive much deeper into the nuts and bolts of the incredible combat system, but it doesn't magically make the level design good. It doesn't improve the game's pacing or fix the story. It doesn't even fix all of the combat. In fact, some fights are made even worse. Admittedly, late in the game, critical mode is amazing. It truly is some of the best combat I've ever experienced in any game. But it comes at the cost of making the entire first half of the game an absolutely monotonous stretch of encounters. These battles were not designed with the thought that players would have access to such overpowered abilities. In other words, critical mode accentuates both the game's best moments and its worst ones. I guess some of this is remedied if you also do a level 1 game and just run past all of the trash mobs, but if you have to purposefully ignore big parts of the game to get to the good stuff, doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose? But this brings us back to my opening line. At its best, Kingdom Hearts 2 is the most compelling and polished combat in the entire series. Fans of Kingdom Hearts 2 are correct in this one instance. That's the one thing I will not only concede to, but flat out praise. Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix has some of the best boss fights in the series. There are a couple of honorable mentions throughout the campaign. The Oogie Boogie fight and the Grim Reaper stand out to me as interesting encounters because of their mechanical gimmicks, but the real stars of the show are the optional secret bosses, all of which fall into the dual classification that I've been talking about for 3 games now, and are almost always the highlight of each Kingdom Hearts title. Kingdom Hearts 2 has 15 of these bosses, and when fought properly, they are all genuinely fantastic. Of course, I'm referring to the post-game battles, Sephiroth, the Data Organization, and the Lingering Will. I spent hours attempting to learn all these bosses' patterns, and though I got my teeth kicked in many a time, I loved fighting them and finally conquering them after much struggle. I had more fun fighting these battles than I did the majority of the fights from all the other Kingdom Hearts titles before and after this one. And with that in mind, I do understand why Kingdom Hearts 2 fans lift this one up as their favorite. But a few hours of fantastic combat didn't make up for another 20 that couldn't captivate me. It sure would have been nice if all of Kingdom Hearts 2 was as great as its optional content, but sadly it's not. Like many, I could sit here and talk about the nuances of the combat for hours, but there are already others whom have done so better than I ever could. They discuss how well implemented the revenge values are, how elegantly you can pepper spells into physical combos, how important guarding is to many of the encounters, and how summons and drive forms are actually useful for specific battles. But it's my feeling that one of the reasons that combat is the sole focus of other critiques of Kingdom Hearts 2 is because that's all Kingdom Hearts 2 really has to offer. And while I understand it's a strange thing to criticize a game whose combat is both its primary and its best feature, it's just not enough for me when combat was only one piece of the puzzle when it came to making the first game great. Not to mention that said combat doesn't reach its full potential on 3 out of the 4 available difficulty levels in the first place. They refined the combat to a mere sheen, but cut or ruined everything else that made the first game special. In my Kingdom Hearts 1 video, I discussed how fantastic Destiny Islands is as an opening level. It perfectly summarizes what you can expect from the game in terms of gameplay and story. Kingdom Hearts 2's Twilight Town, on the other hand, doesn't. If we use Twilight Town as an example of what the rest of the game is going to be, then I guess it'll be a collection of pointless errands that are bound to end in unsatisfactory conclusions? Accurate? It does work really well from a storytelling perspective. Roxas' plight is my favorite of any of the main characters in this series, but after this, the game comes to a grueling halt as we're forced through a whole nother introduction to Sora. That's where we're given a complete explanation of our main quest, which is to go after the organization. Which isn't really a surprise if you played Chain of Memories before Kingdom Hearts 2 like I did. Then your adventure finally begins. But what's the point in me harping on about the story issues when I can just point you in the direction of someone who's already done it better? There's a great video discussing Kingdom Hearts 2's pacing and integration of plot entitled Kingdom Hearts 2's Fatal Flaw by Celtic Phoenix Productions. I'll link to it in the description. It's only about 20 minutes long, and it's definitely worth watching. The summary is that the game's flow is all over the place. The entire first half of the game does nothing to further the main story. The Disney worlds, which were so integral to the first game's overarching themes and plot, have become all but pointless. That is, until you're tasked with revisiting them all again a second time, at which point 2 of the worlds become arguably important to the main story. It's a big upswing there. This has a detrimental impact on the gameplay and story as a whole. It's not so much backtracking that I'm averse to. The original Kingdom Hearts had a lot of treasure chests and Trinity marks that you'd have no means of actually unlocking on your first visit to each world. But revisiting worlds in Kingdom Hearts 1 was a joy because it was player-driven exploration and there were still things to discover naturally. In Kingdom Hearts 2, it's an obligation that, if you're lucky, will take you to one of the game's better boss fights, and pretty much nothing else. This is, once again, a fault of the substandard level design. It's a vicious cycle. The level design doesn't support exploration, which hurts the pacing, because forced return visits to worlds have very little to offer in terms of gameplay beyond generally boring boss fights, with a couple of exceptions. And the boring gameplay isn't bolstered by the storytelling because it's all been relegated to the game's final level anyway. Speaking of, the last level isn't much of an improvement on the rest of the game. The combat finally gets more challenging both in and outside of boss battles, so that's a plus. The Final Mix version makes another huge misstep here, throwing you into a battle against Roxas. Now, it's a great battle on its own, but the fact it's more difficult than even the final boss makes it a roadblock for players not prepared for it, while making the final boss less climactic by comparison. The game throws all the remaining organization members at you one after the other without any real build-up or tension. You then listen to the exposition dumps from Diz and Xemnas before finally going through the final encounter, which is, well, generally a climactic spectacle, if little else. As blasé as I am about the majority of Kingdom Hearts 2's story, I must admit that its ending gets me every time. The reunion of not just Sora and Kairi, but Naminé and Roxas, the final words exchanged, the swell of the music, and the absolutely perfect cut to black right as Kairi and Sora join hands. I hate to sound sappy, but I think it's genuinely beautiful. I love it. While I prefer Roxas' emotional journey over Sora's, this moment is the emotional climax of the entire series for me. This was the perfect way of concluding Sora, Kairi, and Riku's story. But as we all know by now, they didn't end it here like they probably should have. That's the thing about Kingdom Hearts 2. When I look back on it, I first think of all of its best moments. I think about the attack on Radiant Garden and the 1000 Heartless battle, the Colosseum, the post-game data fights, the Cavern of Remembrance, the fitting and memorable ending that beautifully wraps up what could have been a fantastic standalone trilogy. But then, I remember suffering through the Roxas intro. I think of the bland Disney worlds I have to slog through and the arbitrary return trips that do nothing for me. I think of... and I end up seriously contemplating whether or not it's worth it to take the game down off the shelf after all. I just can't escape the fact that Kingdom Hearts 2 is only 1/4 of the game that the first title was. Not in runtime, but in gameplay pillars. What was once a fantastic, if a bit unrefined, combination of combat, exploration, platforming, and light puzzle solving is now just a game with very polished combat. My point is not to say that Kingdom Hearts 2 is a bad game. It's just one that's lacking a lot of the elements that made me fall in love with the series in the first place. And given the direction the series has taken since this title, with its larger focus on level design and overall interactivity, I'd guess that the developers mostly agree with me. As a standalone title, it's a great game. Absolutely magnificent at its best, and still good at its worst. Unfortunately, that worst is the majority of the game's runtime, even on critical mode. The Kingdom Hearts 2 experience for me is the admission that whenever I'm not in a compelling boss battle, I will be bored. And it's hard for me to justify a full playthrough when I know I could have much more fun simply loading up my endgame save and repeating the post-game content. That said, if the Kingdom Hearts series moving forward could somehow combine the design priorities of the first title with the combat of the second, we could legitimately have a contender for one of the best games ever made.